All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being
I'm gonna
here.
start recording.
Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kit Harrington. I am the communications coordinator for Voices for Vermont's Children. We are a research-based multi-issue advocacy organization dedicated to achieving equity and justice for children and youth in Vermont through systems change. And excuse me, I'm so excited to be here today. I feel like this is a very long time coming. It goes all the way back to the very early days of the pandemic, when our first response as an organization was to start to come together, just in keeping with our emphasis on connection and shared processing. We would meet, I think, every day on Zoom and kind of just process what was happening, process the broader context of how it was playing out in the state of Vermont and how it was playing out for children and youth and how it related to legislation and public policy and all of these pieces. And, I think back on the years since then, and it's been hundreds, if not thousands of hours that we have spent in conversation with each other in this space, which is just such a wild shift when you think about it. So we found that we were having these really rich discussions, certainly about policy, about issues impacting children and youth, about child poverty, about the child protection system, about all of these things that are certainly our legislative priorities, education equity. And we also were having a lot of really, I think, nuanced, complex discussions that went deeper and broader in different directions as well. And for a long time, we really wanted to have the opportunity to share those with you. So this is sort of a first step in this direction. And we felt that with the election coming, we've seen some major shifts that are coming through all of the open seats in the legislature this year, and some of the major issues that we're addressing head on coming into the legislative session. So just saw this as a great opportunity to open the door and have a really rich conversation with you all about our 2022 general election voter guide that we just released. And so I'm gonna start out just by giving our wonderful team the opportunity to introduce themselves. And then we'll sort of dig into the voter guide and then have a broader conversation. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or share them. And we'll, if we have time for it, we'll try to get to some of those as well. We only have a little bit of time today, but we're excited to be here with you all. So I'm going to hand it off to Carlin to just give a brief introduction of who you are, and we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carlin Finn. I'm Senior Policy Associate with Voices. I'm in my 28th year with Voices, and yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I guess I'll just say that the last few years, the primary area of focus for me has been education, public education.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Teal. I'm the research director, and I been here for years.
Hey, everyone. I'm Amy Rose. I've held a variety of roles over the last decade or so with Voices, but I'm currently a policy associate focused primarily on child protection and juvenile justice and economic well-being.
Hi, I'm Michelle Fay. I'm executive director. I've been with Voices since 2015, also in a number of roles, and I still participate in some of the economic justice and security work. And I think I'm supposed to just keep on rolling. I do want to acknowledge that our board chair, Scott Rathke, is also with us here, which we're really pleased to have his participation and support. So I just wanted to start out by giving a little context to the voter guide. first of all, Voices is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, tax-exempt charitable organization. So this guide is really meant to be educational in purpose. We do not do endorsements. We don't get involved in campaigns, and so in political campaigns. And so this is really voter education. And I think we were at first kind of aiming to get this out earlier in the summer, and a number of things delayed its execution. But I think the beautiful thing about this product is that it has a life beyond this election. I think our hope is that folks will look at the questions that have been posed, look at the issue context that we provided in the voter guide, and use that to spark conversations with legislators to understand kind of where they stand on issues that we consider to be really pivotal for kids and families, but also to point out that engagement, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but engagement and civic action goes throughout the legislative session. It's not just an electoral activity. So the guide itself, because there's virtually no issue that doesn't impact kids and families, we are just focused in on the campaigns and on the issues that Voices really lifts up. The Voices is sort of the lead advocacy organization on, and we do want to acknowledge that there's other very important large campaigns going on out there in the sphere. Universal school meals, obviously, the childcare campaign. So there's a lot happening for kids and families. Our voter guide is really focused on our two kind of issue area campaigns, which is End Child Poverty, and then a child and youth safety campaign, as well as educational equity, which we've just had a voice in and have been actively engaged in for a number of years. And I just want to acknowledge as well that there's work happening beyond legislation, like the work that we do around implementation. We've become increasingly clear that passing legislation is really just the first step in a process of change and changing systems, and that remaining engaged, following through on the legislative intent, paying attention to where things aren't working the way we thought they might, and then pushing for corrections and change is a big piece of the work of systems change. So that's happening as well on the ground with, for example, the implementation of the Office of Child, Youth, and Family Advocate, the implementation of the community schools model around the state, I think I'm using the wrong terminology there, community schools around the state, we'll just leave it at that. So this is just a snippet of what we do, but we're really excited to bring folks into the conversation with us. How's that, Kit?
That sounds good. And I'm going to put the link for the voter guide in the chat as well. Let's see.
I can say a couple more things about the guide itself, just sort of the layout of it. You'll see as you go through it. It's fairly lengthy. It's 10 pages. The first section is literally pulled from the Secretary of State's language around how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, all those questions. And then there's a bit of a context setting in the beginning that just talks about why acting for kids as having inherent rights right now matters. There's a lot of the framing that we see around investing in the future kind of sidesteps the point that kids have value right now as children, not just as future members of the workforce. And so we wanted to lift that up. And I'll also just say that I've heard in various conversations that there's some pushback about like, well, we've done a lot for kids. Like, I think we can look to the data around child well-being and see that we haven't yet done enough for kids. And so we want to push back on that narrative a little bit. And then before we get into the actual issue areas, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit, there's this first section that's really trying to acknowledge that legislators, especially new legislators, new candidates, I should say, can't be expected to have a fully formed policy position on every policy that might come before them as a legislator, right? And so it's just as important, I think, in making a decision about who's going to represent your interests or your issues and your values the best, to understand how they make decisions, to whom they consider themselves accountable, how they will go about answering questions they may have about the potential unintended consequences of a policy. So we started out with that framework, like, we aren't going to be asking people to pledge to vote a certain way, because we don't actually know what the bill will look like by the time it gets to them. So that can be a really kind of a blunt tool to use to get a general sense of where legislators stand on issues. But when it comes down to it, the saying the devil's in the details is really true about policy. So we want to elect people that have good analysis, understand equity, hold themselves accountable to their constituents in a way that has them kind of seeing themselves as partners, as like servant leaders for the community. So I'll pause there.
You mentioned context, and I think that's so important, and it's a theme that we come back to constantly. And it makes me think about just sort of setting the broader context for folks who may be new to our work, new to advocacy, new to thinking about, voting and elections. And so I guess just as sort of a starting point for our conversation, I wonder, why is it so important for people to connect with their legislators in the first place?
Are you asking me, or do you want anyone to answer?
I'm putting it out there for anyone to jump in.
Well, I mean, I can. I don't want to always be the one, but I always have something to say. I think that legislators obviously bring their lived experience to the role of legislating. They bring whatever research they're able to do. They bring the insights that are offered to them from their friends and family and work networks. But those are inherently limited, right? And so if you're legislating for everyone, you need to actually be hearing from everyone and really understanding. And the policies are I can't always say always, but often made with the best intention, right? People don't run for office to destroy anybody's lives. And so, but you aren't always able as a legislator. And I say this, I should acknowledge I was a legislator for one brief moment in time. You aren't able to think through and fully understand or know how a particular policy might play out for a person. And so hearing from people who would be impacted by a policy, who could say, this is a thing you're forgetting, it makes a huge difference. And legislators need to know that. I think we've seen that play out in our communities and around the nation, where people kind of made a decision based on an ideology or a dogmatic position. And then once they heard about how that actually played out in people's lives, they were like, whoa, I hadn't considered that. So for me, that's there's a lot of reasons why constituents should be in touch with their legislator, but the more people are involved and express how it will impact their lives, the better the policy will be. That's my take.
I agree, Michelle. And it's also important to create the space for people to make brave choices. And I think it's much easier for a legislator to make a bold move if there's support from the constituents. And so it's important to, after they're elected, kind of support them in the hard choices that they'll have to make.
I think that's an important decision. We're sort of walking along the line of talking about the importance of sharing lived experience in the context of being a constituent speaking to legislators. And then there's also the importance of elevating and centering lived experience in the process of policymaking too, which I know is something that's been a big part of certainly of our approach to some, certainly to the Office of Child and Youth and Family Advocate. And Amy, I wonder if there's any additional context you can share around that.
Sure. So I think the legislature has become much more accessible with Zoom and with meetings being recorded, but it's really difficult to get to follow all the hearings and get to them throughout the legislative session. And so I think it's really important for folks to have their voice included, both in the constructing of the policy, but then also watching the process as it evolves and knowing when and how to add their voice, either behind the scenes or directly in testimony. And so we did a lot of work with the Office of Child, Youth and Family Advocate, but also with the broader child protection and economic justice work to really just listen for honestly a number of years to folks who have been impacted by our current systems. And we learned a great deal. My hope is that we built strong relationships in that process. And so when things were changing in legislation that we needed to understand better, we could go back to folks and ask them directly their thoughts, and also just kind of lift up their stories, often in a safe way. We know that, when you're connected to systems that have power over your lives, it can be kind of scary to engage so publicly. And when you're working with children and youth who may not want their story public for the remainder of their life, it's really important to be mindful of that. And so our work was trying to send your lived experience, but do it in a way that was respectful and on folks' own terms.
This connection between, what that elevates for me is another thing that we've talked a lot about in the context of the election and of our work, which is the value and the importance of taking a relational approach versus a transactional approach. And I wonder, Carlin, if you can speak to that a little bit in the context of some of the education equity work that Voices has been doing.
Sure. I think so. I'm listening to Amy and Michelle. I was thinking about another part of folks being in touch with their legislators, and it's maybe the reverse, which is, we talk a lot about that we have a quote unquote citizen legislature, and that there's easy access to legislators, to committee meetings and all that. But there really isn't. I mean, it's maybe a citizen legislature, but there really isn't that easy access. And it's really can be daunting for people. And so I think that one of the things that we and other organizations that are acting as advocates can do is really through different avenues be able to share and allow, or not allow, but encourage and hope that folks will get involved. And in education is a perfect example of where there's often a disconnect between what the legislature is focused on and what's going on in communities, in schools. I think that being able to have and take the time for folks in their communities to not only hear what the legislators are talking about and thinking about, but also to be able to offer different perspectives and try to broaden or make a little more whole that process. So I don't know if that actually answered your question, but I think it's true in many of the different areas that we work in and focus on. But I've over the past 3 years, there's so much policy and education related to education that are disconnected. They're just like these things out there, and part of that is, I think, is one, maybe an unwillingness to really resource whatever laws we put into place, but also that we really haven't had an opportunity to vet these policies with the people, with young people, with students, with educators, with community members and families. So it's so critical to do that. It takes so much time. It really matters that, you know, we take the time to do that. And it's tough. It is tough for, you know, the legislatures is part-time, and you know, they don't have staff really, and so, you know, there's a bunch of challenges there, but yeah, that.
I can just add to that. One of the things that I really value about Voices is I think we take seriously that we're a learning organization. And so oftentimes, I think the difference between a transactional and a relational connection with folks is we don't often, you know, ask people to come in and say specific things on our behalf, but we really are listening deeply to the folks who are impacted by the systems that are being supported. And so oftentimes, we're learning through the process, and a lot of our policy agenda items might change a little bit or shift based on what we're hearing from the community. And it's nice to be able to kind of step back and have the time to listen and to learn and to shift if we need to, as we're working through a session or a policy idea or even our planning process.
I think that's such an important point, and it sort of brings up for me the relationship between our capacity as advocates, as constituents, as legislators to make space for context, and how that propels the opportunity to sort of think about policy change more systemically. And that's one of the biggest things that I feel that I've had the opportunity to learn in engaging with Voices. And I wonder if anyone can sort of speak to that, how that relationship between context and systemic change, and why it is so important to think systemically about making change for children and youth, and maybe, you know, even or a step further in terms of how do we develop policy or think about policy change on individual issues in a more interrelated sense that considers how it connects and impacts the greater whole.
Well, I mean, to some degree, I'm not sure if this gets at what you're asking exactly, Kit, but it's a big question. I think the way that policy work happens, and I don't think this is unique to Vermont at all, but you know, you've got organizations that are centered around a particular issue, a particular constituency, a membership, and the priorities that come out of that constituency are kind of naturally driven by that, you know, by their interests. And then you also have the issue of like, who's funding advocacy work in the state, and what's their agenda? And I'm not using agenda in a bad, like everyone has one, right? We all have an agenda. And so, so the fact that a lot of advocacy work and issue work it develops in silos, like naturally. So then how do we, as sort of, if we want to use like the grassroots analogy or frame, like how do we at the grass tops level kind of peek over the top of the silo and figure out where, you know, how to push back against the inherent scarcity narrative that lives in the legislature, that lives in policymaking, scarcity both in terms of financial resources that the state's willing to you know, to put toward issues, but also like legislators' time and bandwidth. And so there's so many important things happening, competing for very limited time in terms of legislators' capacity. And then I think Voices would question the scarcity narrative around resources in the state. Like there's clearly room to make different choices about where public funding goes, who should be paying more into the public good. So I think that's just like a framing up of the context for me, is like most people, I guess, doing their issue specific work care about these other issues, but they aren't funded to focus on them, or their constituency isn't focused on that issue. So I think it's incumbent on those of us who are in the State House, who are communicating with legislators, to push against the the like impulse to just keep your blinders on and keep your head down and do your thing, because that's not how families' lives are. That's not how people's lives are. They don't live siloed lives. They need healthcare, they need childcare, they need, access to paid family medical leave, they need affordable housing, safe housing, like not one of those things won't solve problems for kids and families. They need all of those things to be in place, and they need the state to say, we're going to figure out how to be able to consider all these issues and put forward a plan. And that might require us, in terms of your systems thinking question, like, is the way the legislators even set up adequate to solve problems like that? Because, as we've said, it's a so-called citizen legislature, although I think some of us might push back against that based on who's actually able to financially and childcare wise and everything to actually serve, right? It's in fact not available to everyone. And the fact that it's part-time and it forces people to well, we got to get something done this year. And so they might put in place an imperfect bill just to get something done, or say, well, we're going to do this one thing this year and we're going to focus on that thing next year, but there's no way to ensure accountability around those commitments. So I'm rambling a bit, but those are the things that popped to mind for me.
I think it's certainly something I can empathize with, just the feeling of overwhelm when there are so many really pressing cumulative things going on all at once, how to kind of just even have the expansiveness to step back and think about how they're all interrelated when each one feels like needs to be dealt with right now. But I guess kind of like tying it back into the election, can anyone sort of speak to how voters might be able to apply sort of systemic thinking to thinking about which candidates to support, for example?
If anyone else has something to say, raise your hand so I'll step back. But I always, as I said, always have something to say. I mean, one of the things that pops to mind for me is like seeing legislators who are super literal about, and I think this goes back to the transactional versus relational thing, super literal about representing their constituents. And they will like literally take a tick sheet and be like, well, I heard from 3 more people against this issue than I did for it, so I'm voting against it. As opposed to really doing having the capacity to think about who is most impacted by this policy, and actually weighting those constituents' input as more important than the input of a constituent that is not actually going to be that impacted by it. Or in some cases, if you're going at policymaking through an equity frame, someone might make the case that they're just as impacted because resources are being redistributed. But if that's in service to an equitable outcome, I think, again, that links a little bit back to Amy's comment about being brave, being courageous, making stands that might be politically tricky. It might put your reelection on the line or something, but you're there to advance the well-being of people in the state, not to get reelected. So ask me how I know. Yeah. Anyway.
And I think legislators hear from their constituents in a wide variety of situations. And so having been more closely connected to the child protection work in the last few years, I've heard from many legislators that that's one of the areas that people call them about when they're in crisis. And so there's a difference between saying, I've had 1 to 20 people call me in the last few months with specific issues and trying to help them navigate our systems to solve those issues, and trying to figure out the root cause of why there's either a lack of information or things are not happening as one would hope or intend. And so I think that's kind of often the impetus for bills to come about is when people start hearing from multiple people about a similar problem, and they're trying to figure out sort of not just how to, help their constituents through their individual life situation, but really figure out why at a more broad level their constituents' needs aren't getting met.
I wonder if I sort of want to give time and opportunity as well to kind of dig into a little bit into some of the issues that are elevated in the context of the voter guide and how they can help shape how, pieces of those for people who might not have the time in this moment to read through the entire guide. What are some things that they can keep in mind as they're thinking about these three central issues that we've elevated here: education equity, child poverty, and child safety. So Amy, I don't know if you want to start in terms with maybe with child safety and
So all of the issues that I'm working on seem to be deeply related, so it's hard for me to kind of separate them, but
that's okay too.
Okay, so
Definitely.
I am excited just to follow up on some of the implementation pieces I'm going to put in the chat. There's a website started for the Oversight Commission for the Child, Youth, and Family Advocate position, and we're really excited about starting the hiring process for that role and standing up the office that we've been waiting for. But in terms of, all of the information that was unearthed in that process of trying to create this role as a mechanism to kind of bring together some of the issues that have been happening within our state, we've learned quite a bit about the intersection between persistent trauma through poverty and involvement in our deeper layers of the system. And so, what we know is that when children have experienced trauma and end up either in state care or kind of living in this persistent space of not having their needs met, that their outcomes are not great, right? And that creates a bigger reliance on our other systems with mental health, incarceration, challenges within education, and even honestly untimely deaths. And so one of the things we're trying to work on is figuring out the true family prevention pieces. And we know much of what works. We know that if we give families the money that they need to pay their bills and have housing and food and all of those needs met, that alleviates the strain of poverty on children, youth, and families. And so we're really excited to have a big conversation this year about Reach Up and the context behind it as our social safety net system, and understand sort of where it came from in Vermont when there wasn't a rateable reduction to where we are today, where the program base grants are really at less than half of what they need to be to get to just even the basic needs level. Also in these conversations, we've heard from youth and families of youth that they don't often feel like they have a voice in the decisions that are being made about them. And so we just want to create opportunities, whether it be in a court structure or beforehand, to make sure that the folks who are representing them, whether it be JALs or attorneys or even their parents, are sharing the full narrative on their behalf. And if they feel as though they're not, they have an opportunity to get their voice out there. We love to think big and talk about, youth transitioning out of care as well. And, when you look at sort of the more vulnerable populations within our state, they're a group that I think if we invested more heavily in, we would be able to kind of break some of the cycles of repeated trauma. And so we're looking at kind of creative ideas to support youth in that age group as well. And then there's been a whole bunch of other issues that have been coming up. And I think Voices is in a tricky place of trying to make sure that we tend to all of them and we listen to the folks who are reaching out to us, and also aware of what we can do well or what we can support. And so we're also very excited about this Office of Child, Youth, and Family Advocate as a place that we can refer folks to and learn from as we're moving forward.
Thanks, Amy. Carlin, do you want to jump in?
Well, sure. I feel like I pretty much touched on what we elevated in the voter guide, but which is, really we have all these policies in place and they're all hanging out there by themselves. So with the intention, it seems, the intention of moving toward, a little more toward away from reform and toward transformation. But so I guess I'd say, and this isn't included in the voter guide, but both Amy and Michelle touched on this, is the how important implementation is. And in 2021, we passed legislation in Vermont that established the framework for community schools. And that, with some funding, some federal, ESSER funding, ESSER, oh gosh, anyway, the federal funding for COVID, for schools. So there's 3-year grants for 5 schools, but the framework itself is does something that gets us to this, could get us to this issue of how we how we don't really do implementation. We don't pay attention to it. If we did, this framework will really helps us bring in a lot of the policies that we already have, because they're focused on school climate, they're focused on family and community engagement. They're, the pillars include really shared leadership and bringing community and folks together to think about what's the best way to do that in their communities. It gives some ownership to families and students and other community members to their schools. And it includes wraparound, really focus on wraparound services. And, I can, just because I've spent so much time thinking and, researching this, I could take pretty much every policy that we have, education policy that we've passed in the last 20 years, and, bring it together, and it would fit within the context of community schools if we had the resources and commitment to do that work, that implementation of this framework. So it's exciting and it's frustrating, because I don't see how without ongoing resources and a commitment that this could actually happen. So, but I'm excited because it could. We have the framework, and so it could, and that's what we're focusing on in our work in the education part.
Oh, you're muted, Kit.
Just thinking about how that can translate for someone who is trying to look at all of the candidate statements and endorsements and things that are out there, and trying to maybe draw out a couple of, from this broader context of just like, what are some key issues that we're hoping to be hearing from, like that candidates are speaking on, that they're acknowledging are important. What are some things that, for someone who's out there listening might say, oh, this is an indication that they're thinking about some of the things that are important to me to be thinking about when it comes to kids and youth in Vermont.
I think Sarah's the ideal person to answer that, because she does the Kids Count data book and pulls out all of these well-being indicators and is still able to kind of keep the micro and the macro together in terms of sort of what are the big things that shift systems thinking. So sorry, Sarah.
Thanks. I knew somebody was going to do that to me. I actually want to turn that back around maybe a little bit. I've been thinking about, as I'm hearing all these threads, I'm thinking about power. And so just to start from like a data and research position, as much as we all find it useful to have that data and research, I think a lot about, and Voices talks a lot about how that can actually also be used in sort of a gatekeep way, or a way of delaying, denying. I almost want to say gaslighting, but sometimes it's just the idea that somebody can come and say, here's our policy, here's our idea, here's what we know we need. And the answer often comes back, well, we need more data, we need more evidence, and in fact, we don't at this point. Like, that all exists and has existed for decades. We don't need to reprove, certain hypotheses like that. So I guess what I want to say is, like, if we didn't have inequitable distributions of power, we wouldn't need half the data that we need. It just would, it's filling this gap between sort of a democratic, system and something that's very like top driven. And so to connect that back to Carlin, when you were talking about community schools as an example, part of that model, right, has to do with a self-determination on the part of students, families, their bigger community. And that would have to come with a lot of trust, either trust, or the power would have to be redistributed such that a community can say, this is what we know we need. And the answer comes back, okay, here you go. Like, so I guess just, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about is when we think about resources and systems and who they work for and who they don't work for, it all tracks with how the power is distributed. So I think I would want to hear legislators who are able to talk about that analysis and say, like, who can actually see that and are willing to, like, not participate in upholding the status quo, but instead, like, shine some more light on it.
Michelle, I wonder if you have anything to add to that.
I'm just basking in the glow of Sarah's insightful. And Sarah always comes in like at the
I
end
know.
and just like does these beautiful sort of, yeah. I mean, I agree with everything Sarah said, and I'm trying to like moderate myself so I don't seem like my hair's on fire, but yeah, I mean, I talked about this yesterday at our staff meeting. I am like a fairly recent, convert, not really convert, but I'm really into learning more about degrowth. And so when I hear legislators, when I hear candidates talking about that the answer to everything is growing the economy, that to me is a major red flag. It's a major red flag, because that growth imperative has been terrible for kids. It's been terrible for the planet. And so I want to hear people who are like really, as Sarah said, questioning the status quo, because the status quo was designed for and by a certain population of folks, and it's only been good for them, and frankly not even good for them in the long run, right? Like, as the planet crumbles around us. So I'm really interested in people who are willing to unlearn and who demonstrate an openness to unlearn everything we've been taught as to what an economy should look like, what people's value is, what individuals' value is to the community or to the world, which is why I think that, the intro to the voter guide, just sort of so much of the framing that we hear, and this is not, I think, a nonpartisan statement, is so focused on workforce and jobs, and I'm not saying we don't need jobs. Like, I just think there needs to be a balance. Like, what are we doing, and for whom, and why, so I think an openness, a curiosity, a demonstrated sense of accountability to to the voices that aren't really strongly represented in decision-making circles. And so, like, earlier when I think when Carlin was talking about education, like there are, or even when I was talking about the silos, like there are organized entities that are representing different workforces, different unions, different, and then there's industries that have, like associations, and they're representing their interests. But when it comes to sort of just people who fall through the cracks or whose identities aren't strongly enough, associated with a constituency that they have a funded lobbyist, let's say, like they need a voice. And so legislators or candidates that tune into those, like, who am I not hearing from? Who's not able to be at the table because they are barely making it and they don't have time, to show up for community meetings or to come testify, or there's other power differentials that we've talked about, like the people who are seeking out those folks who are going to them to hear before they make a decision, like, so we're going to be taking a vote on this thing. How would this impact you, foster parents of Vermont? How would this impact you, parents involved with the parent-child centers? How would this impact you, youth? I get more excited about those candidates for sure.
Carlin, Amy, Sarah, I wonder just if you have anything to add in terms of what you're looking for when you're thinking about the characteristics or values that really stand out, or an indication to you that a candidate or a legislator is really thinking about the broader context and equity, certainly more broadly, and then also more specifically for children and youth.
I'm really drawn to legislators or elected officials who are curious, who can really balance the sort of urgency of the moment with sort of the real need to understand deeply. And I think that there is a difference, getting back to the relational piece, between bringing in voices in kind of a performative way and bringing in folks to really understand. And so one of the things that can be hard as an advocate, but I really appreciate, is the skill of asking good questions and taking time to digest answers and coming back to things and just really being able to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers and the answers are always changing, and being willing to kind of work through that, even if it makes you a little bit more vulnerable.
Well, I have to just echo what Amy and Michelle said, because and the way I think about it is can policymakers start with a big picture? Can they, and then they're asking questions, they're curious, they're maybe taking what appear to be siloed or what are siloed issues and finding a framework for them, an umbrella, something that can take them out of all the stuff that's coming at them about that one particular issue or constituents that are advocating for it. So I think that's just another way of echoing what Michelle and Amy said.
How about you, Kit? Do you get to answer your own question?
I'm just the moderator. No, I think for me, I think so many of the things that you already spoke to are really that willingness to, and that openness to strive toward bringing more in. I think is really what I hear echoed is that it's all about that context and that willingness to engage with context bravely, because I certainly understand that that can feel scary or overwhelming. And I don't have the experience, certainly as a legislator, to know all of the different things that they're balancing given the limitations on the role. And but just that openness to learning and to acknowledging that they're in that space of learning and I think to me is something that is really important. It's a response. It's not just a willingness to bring context into the conversation, but a responsiveness to the context as it arises. So I think, Sarah, unless if you have anything, I think there's so much territory that was covered right there. Just as we're sort of starting to round out our time, I think in another month or so, just over a month, the election will have happened. At the end, not all of the candidates that we support are always going to win. And I just kind of want to bring it around to thinking more broadly about the legislative ecosystem and why it's so important to continue to engage with legislators, this idea of accountability, and how that what that can look like outside of the context of the election. It's not just something that we tune into every 2 years, but something that how can we continue to engage and why is it important?
Well, it's often been said that that 3 phone calls, and I don't know if this still is true, but I think legislators still say this, like 3 phone calls can, in a state like Vermont, can equate to like a tsunami of support or opposition. So, because let's face it, like this again, I'm like, this is unique to Vermont. Like people aren't that tuned in to local politics, right? Or to local policy making. So, in fact, it can be a real point of frustration during, especially during presidential election years, that people are like so fired up about national level politics when in fact their local elections and even down to school board and select board, right, can have much more impact on their daily lives than who ends up being president. I mean, it's a gross statement, but I think your question is why it matters to stay engaged, and like that's when the decisions are being made. Like it's easy on the campaign trail. It's not easy, but what happens on the campaign trail is you give broad brushes about what you believe in, what you support, and then when you get into the state house, you are parsing out the details of what that legislation is going to look like. And broad statements of policy that we all would agree on when they get in that building and start being torn apart or minimized, or trade-offs are being made. Some trade-offs are fine. Some trade-offs, this is something we talk about a lot, like some incremental measures are good. They actually are a base that you can build from, and other things that people put in place as incremental measures can actually do more harm than good, right? And so I think remaining engaged as constituents, as community members, as legislators are doing that negotiation is really critical to make sure that anything they do at least does no harm. Like that ought to be the baseline. And ideally it's answering a specific need for the community and or creating a stepping stone to getting where we want to go.
I was thinking about again what Amy said. Like the ideal, having curiosity, asking questions. That's what we look for in legislators. I think that's what is really can be modeled by constituents for legislators too. So to continue to ask questions, to be curious, to provide good data, anecdotal, all sorts of different ways to stay engaged, so that for some, as Michelle said earlier, that, you know, kind of tick off a box of we got pro 5 and, you know, anti 6, I'm going to vote anti. So, you know, is really engaging with the, you know, as curious about, you know, how do you know beyond that mechanism of making decisions. So yeah, that would be, and that's hard. That, you know, as we were talking about, people don't have all the time in the world to follow what's going on in the legislature. So I think that's part of what our job is, or, you know, is to offer that, to be curious and to be and to share that with constituents and to help them come in when they can to do that as well.
I think another thing that I've sort of in my time with Voices and back in Vermont, sort of shifting to thinking about something that at times seemed sort of impenetrable or vague or just not something that I felt necessarily that I understood or could connect to or had some role in, was just the value, you know, as you said, is not necessarily having feeling the need to have to be coming as an expert, right? But that's certainly that idea that our lived experience is the expertise and the value that we bring to that conversation when we're engaging with legislators, and how important that is. I think I often felt that why did my opinion matter? What did I really know? And I think just that trying to reinforce that there really is value in just building that relationship, building that connection. I think for me, that's part of what brought me back to Vermont is the potential for change that's inherent in, you know, living in a state that's not just so small population wise, but so small geographically, that we are one another's neighbors. We do all live together and come together in community centers. So just taking advantage of those opportunities and realizing that, you know, that legislators are open to them and they're looking for them, and that they really do have an impact and they really do matter. So I think, you know, I think just hearing all of these perspectives about context, you know, that is the context. I think so much of it is the context that each one of us brings. So we're just about at time here. Well, we're past time actually. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and certainly thank Amy and Carlin and Michelle and Sarah so much. I hope this is just the first of future discussions. If you had questions that you weren't able to have answered, please feel free to follow up. I'll put you can and to certainly to subscribe on our website. You can find us at voicesforvtkids.org. So thank you all so much. I'm gonna stop recording. And stop live stream.